You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791.
And it falls to the Americans in this stunning action, which, again, when you compare this back to 1758, where a 16,000-man army sustains almost 2,000 casualties, the highest numbers of casualties when you consider all sides of the entire 18th century, that they've captured it in mere minutes in the middle of the night is a huge accomplishment. So the optics of it, in some ways, really outweigh what actually happened in the moment. What they find is all the equipment that they expected in some ways. Between there and Crown Point, which they also captured shortly afterwards, there's almost 200 cannon, depending on how we quantify these.
Hello, and welcome to episode 436 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. On March 17, 1776, British General William Howe withdrew his forces from Boston, an act that ended nearly a year of military occupation. Now, Howe and his army departed not because they lost in some battlefield defeat, but because of the sight of cannon, massive, heavy cannon, staring down at them from Dorchester Heights. Now, these guns that sat atop the heights of Dorchester had traveled an extraordinary path to get there. They were hauled by teams of oxen, draft horses, and sheer human will. The cannon traveled across frozen rivers, mountain passes, and frozen roads. And they had come from a crumbling stone fortress in northern New York, a place called Fort Ticonderoga. 250 years later, the story of these cannons that reached Boston remains one of the most remarkable feats of the American Revolution. No, it wasn't a battle or a daring raid, but it was the logistical triumph that required a 25-year-old bookseller named Henry Knox to move nearly 60 tons of artillery across 150 miles of winter terrain. It's a story that involves competing commissions, regional rivalries, a half-destroyed fort, and an audacious pre-dawn raid, all before a single cannon rolled south towards Boston. Now, to explore this logistical triumph, we're joined by historian Matthew Cagle. Matthew is the curator at Fort Ticonderoga, where he oversees one of the largest collections of 18th century military material culture in North America. He's also a scholar with expertise in the American Revolution. Now, during our exploration, Matthew reveals how a French wartime fortification built of timber and limestone became one of the most strategically important positions in North America. How a pre-dawn raid led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold and about 80 men captured Fort Ticonderoga in May 1775. And how Henry Knox, aided by Philip Schuyler and a network of Continental soldiers, teamsters, and local farmers, pulled off a logistical feat that broke the siege of Boston. But first, I have some exciting news to share. You may have heard our new announcement at the start of this episode, that Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and that this episode was made possible with support from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791. Over the next 6 months, the Massachusetts Historical Society is partnering with us to ensure that we can continue to make our episodes and resources freely available to you. Now, this partnership means a great deal to me personally, because the MHS was my first archive. It was the first archive where I'd ever conducted primary source research. During the summer of 2001, I started to work on a research project about the Battle of Bunker Hill and the Bunker Hill Monument. One of my college professors introduced me to the then CEO of the MHS so that I could learn more about how special collections libraries work and start researching what would become my undergraduate honors thesis. Now, since 2001, the MHS has served as my intellectual home. It's where I attend seminars and learn about the work of other historians. It's where I turn to for help whenever we want to include special resources for this podcast. And it's where I continue to learn about digital technologies for historical research and historical collections. The MHS has been a constant in my life over the last 25 years, and I was really touched and honored when they offered to help support the podcast this year. And you'll start to see the benefits of this partnership today. The MHS owns Henry Knox's journals, and they kindly provided us with a link for our show notes so that you can gain easy access to Knox's very own writing about his adventure hauling cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston in early 1776. So a big thank you to the Massachusetts Historical Society for supporting Ben Franklin's World and our work here. I'm really excited about what this partnership will bring and what it'll allow us to do over the next 6 months. All right, are you ready for an adventure? Without further ado, allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Our guest is a historian of early America and the curator at Fort Ticonderoga. He holds a PhD from the Bard Graduate Center in New York City, and his research expertise is in the American Revolution. Now, before joining the staff at Fort Ticonderoga in 2014, our guest worked in exhibit creation, curation, research, and historical interpretation across many states, from Massachusetts to South Carolina. He's received fellowships in support of his work, including the American Trust for the British Library and the William L. Clements Library Transatlantic Fellowship. He joins us today to help us explore Fort Ticonderoga and Henry Knox's noble train of artillery. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Matthew Cagle.
Great to be here.
After nearly a year of British military occupation, on March 17, 1776, General William Howe withdrew his British forces from Boston, and his retreat was in large part due to the cannon that Henry Knox took from Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York and placed on Dorchester Heights earlier on March 4, 1776. And from Dorchester Heights, these cannons looked straight down on the British position in Boston. Matthew, it is the 250th anniversary of the British evacuation of Boston, so I think it's fitting that we're gathered to talk about Henry Knox and his noble train of artillery. But first, before we get into that story, I wonder if we could start our conversation in New York at Fort Ticonderoga. Margie would like to know more about Fort Ticonderoga, where it is, and what its origin story is.
Yeah, that's a great point. So Fort Ticonderoga wasn't always Fort Ticonderoga. Originally, it was constructed as Fort Withdrawl by the French. That quickly got converted into the more common name Fort Garrison. And this was built during the 7 Years' War, what we call here in America the French and Indian War. And to kind of situate us on a map, you got to look very far to the north, and you're literally almost in Canada at almost the foot of Lake Champlain. So in some ways, it's more useful, I think, to think about the perspective broadly of North America, of coming in through the St. Lawrence River, through the heart of New France, going down to the south, the Richelieu River, which then opens up into Lake Champlain, which is today the border between northern New York State and Vermont. And the lake crosses into what is today Quebec a little as well. And if you go down a good ways down that lake, you'll find a point where there is a body of water called Lake George, now in New York, that empties into Lake Champlain. And Ticonderoga is at that location. So in today's terms, we're about 2 hours drive north of Albany, maybe 2.5 hours south of Montreal, located at this critical juncture of waterways in early America.
And those waterways were super important in the history of early New York and early Canada. So would you tell us more about the Hudson and St. Lawrence rivers and their river valleys and about their importance as they allowed water travel from Montreal to New York City and the Atlantic Ocean?
Yeah. It's one of these areas where on either side of Lake Champlain, certainly in New York, but then also as you get into what is today Vermont, you find serious mountain ranges. Part of the broader Appalachian chain runs through here. And so this waterway allows you to move much more easily in what is otherwise pretty mountainous, rugged territory. And the volume of Lake Champlain, of Lake George, allows for heavier traffic as well, which became important to these European armies. But of course, this had been a corridor of human activity for thousands of years prior to this, and also one that interestingly was a kind of, not a firm barrier, but marked the peripheries of different native groups and language groups, with Iroquoian-speaking peoples on the western side in New York, of course, the Mohawk at the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee, and then Algonquin-speaking peoples on the other side. And of course, these aren't firm borders. We see people moving back and forth based on the archaeological evidence, but the waterways become an important access point for this whole region, and of course provide a lot of things as well. And so as Imperial War breaks out in North America, we see this area becoming a flashpoint because it is a point of contact and from that conflict. And this goes back to the earliest documented military actions at Ticonderoga, which actually occur in the summer of 1609 between Native American war parties that, on one side at least, coming from the St. Lawrence Valley, happen to have some Frenchmen, their new allies, alongside. And that begins really almost 150 years or more of the Champlain Valley becoming this key corridor for conflict as the different European powers, as different Native American nations really vie for access and control to the interior of North America and this waterway that allows you to move much more quickly and easily between all of these different places.
And I don't really think that we can overstate quickly and easily for the 18th century here, because today, when we travel to Fort Ticonderoga, we can easily take the New York Thruway and enjoy a relatively nice drive. But in the 18th century, any roads early Americans had were really rough, and travel could take quite a long time because those roads were rough. So having these rivers, like the Hudson River and the St. Lawrence River, where you could traverse New York north and south, or the Mohawk River, where you could go east and west across New York, those are really important in this period.
Absolutely. And the region that we are in at Ticonderoga is still in the 1750s at the periphery of both English and French claims and usage of this area. The French built a fort a few decades before Fort Carillon at Crown Point, where Lake Champlain widens dramatically, Fort Saint-Frédéric. And that was their kind of southernmost extension of French power or trade and all of that kind of thing. And of course, that throughout the 18th century, the colonial wars between Britain and France had become a target. So there'd been numerous expeditions launched by the English toward Crown Point. And eventually, Crown Point in some ways is superseded by the significance of Fort Carillon, what is Ticonderoga, by the time we get into the 7 Years' War.
So was the purpose of Fort Ticonderoga, of Fort Carillon, as it was known to the French, was this fort built to control this north-south waterway and the trade and communication that happened along this river valley?
Yeah, Fort Carillon has an interesting origin, and it's different from a lot of the other forts that we see across North America that are often about preserving trade routes or solidifying contacts between various different networks coming from parts of the hinterland towards colonial metropolitan centers, or that are coastal fortifications built solely for the defense of those kind of ports. Ticonderoga is different in that regard because the French build it during wartime. It's not a peacetime fortification. It's not there to protect existing networks of trade. It is there to defend from enemy attack. It's begun in the late fall of 1755, and the instructions that were sent to the Canadian-born engineer who designed it were really to go to Fort Saint-Frédéric at Crown Point, kind of assess that fortification, which had been built decades earlier and was fine for the French to be able to assert their control or their prominence in the region, but would not have stood up to especially English artillery. And as the English are planning attacks northward, as Crown Point once again becomes a target in the beginning of the 7 Years' War, they need something that's more modern, that's more advanced to both protect Crown Point itself, but then also protect this broader riverine, lacustrine access to the heart of New France. Because from the south, that's almost the only way you can get there from the heavily populated parts of New England and New York, where the British are going to draw a lot of manpower and resources from in this broader campaign. So it is built solely as a military fortification, as almost the advance guard, kind of the furthest extent of French control in this region to block any approach further north.
What I find really interesting about this is, as you mentioned, Fort Carillon was built during the 7 Years' War. And if you think about how wartime structures might be built, you're building them fast and loose, right? You don't have a lot of time before you're going to have to defend your position. But when we visit Fort Ticonderoga today, we see this massive stone fortification. So were the French able to build this stone fortification in 1755, or did they start their fort as many forts start out, which is that its initial structure is made out of trees and using trees to build palisades or kind of a fortification around it?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of one of the experiences of looking at the history of Fort Ticonderoga through the lens of the modern museum Fort Ticonderoga, which was founded in the early 20th century and based around a reconstruction of the ruins of the fort at that time, and that we have done subsequently. And it does skew our impression of the place because you see this almost timeless, massive stone fortification, which in many places is quite true to what the original fortifications were. In other areas, though, is actually quite different because the French sent their engineers, their troops down in the fall of 1755, and their orders that they had were to survey the area, build a fortification, and they did that using the material that was available, which is, like most fortifications, as you mentioned, wood. Wood is abundant in the interior unless it has been hewn or taken down in areas. So he's surveying, the Canadian engineer, this whole forest. He says at various times that, he can almost not make out where he is because of the trees around them. Those trees are leveled and they begin to lay them out, not as the kind of upright palisades that we think of in some ways as a kind of frontier fortification in North America, but as hewn timbers laying, one on top of each other and separated by a gap, and then another row of hewn timbers that they're going to fill with earth to make a massive fortification, because this is designed to withstand English artillery. This is not just a palisade fort to protect against small arms that Native Americans will have. This has to stand up to the biggest guns that the English can build. What they find when they get there is they start building this fort, which is pretty typical for the period, but they realize fairly quickly that there's not a lot of topsoil here. We stand on a ridge of limestone. That's why we're at the height that we are, looking over the valley here. And it means that you go down a few feet or less in some cases, and you're hitting bare rock. So they don't have the materials in terms of the volume of earth that they might need to fill up a fortification like this. And on top of that, they hadn't anticipated this, so they hadn't brought masons or masonry tools to be able to use that to their advantage. Now, over the first winter, so basically by about February of 1756, they're like, this is good enough. We've built enough, log buildings. We can house a holding garrison for the winter. The walls are as tall as a person, so we can defend them if need be. And when they come back in the spring, which is typical, the armies go back to the metropolitan centers in New France, or for the English down in New York or New England. And then they go into the field in the spring. They come back, they bring masons, they bring tools, and they start to exploit the rock that is here. So the fort that is built over the French, and it's really in some ways not even fully completed by the time the English take it in 1759, based at least on their projections, it is a strange hybrid fortification where you maintain the use of these thick log walls because you're not going to rebuild your fort in the middle of a war, but you add to that using masonry. So the outer works, the counterscarps, the ravelins, the barracks inside end up being built of stone around the core enceinte of the fort, which is built of wood, which is not the way anyone would build a fort by the book in the time period. But like you say, this is wartime. They're working with the situations, the materials that are available to them.
And how did Fort Carillon perform in the 7 Years' War? The war that would see the British emerge as the strongest, most powerful military in the European world. How did a wooden Fort Carillon perform against the British artillery during the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga in 1758?
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, the walls being wood backed with earth, to the tune of 20 feet thick, even the Marquis de Montcalm, the French commander who's dispatched in 1756 to North America, says this is actually pretty good defense against artillery. And I have to say, having done some experiments here at the museum, live firing cannon into earthen works, it's amazing how well earth can absorb artillery fire. So in that sense, you've got a pretty good defense. In the end, though, the fort itself is never really tested because the fort that we see today, which we think about as this strong point, is in some ways the citadel of last resort. If your enemy is getting to the walls of the fort, you've done something wrong. And it's a bitter, bitter fight along those walls. Plus, the fort was only ever designed to house maybe a maximum of 350, 450 men, which is enough to hold it over the winter, to prevent somebody from taking it by surprise over the winter, which is the really vulnerable period. In the summer, when the field armies get dispatched out in the field, you would have thousands of troops, more than could ever fit in the fort. They're camping outside. And in 1758, when the English advance an army of nearly 16,000 men, which I want to reiterate is the largest field army that had probably been seen in North America to this time, when they're advancing that northward up Lake George, the French, they can't fight in the fort. They pull their forces back and they actually establish a defensive work on a height of land about a half mile to the west of the fort. So they've got the area there. They've also, this engineer who had designed the fort had kept a forest more or less standing, kind of a strategic timber reserve that could be felled to build defenses. And the French army, which numbered less than 4,000 men here, and had very few native allies with them, as they had in previous campaigns, for a host of other reasons, finds themselves having to construct this fortification and in literally 48 hours fells a forest, creates a log breastwork that they could fight behind. And the English, rather than bringing up their artillery to bombard the lines or ultimately the fort itself, decide instead on a frontal assault by their infantry. And that ends up being a catastrophe. And so the engagement at Ticonderoga on July 8th of 1758 ends up, by the end of the day's fighting, which covers almost half the day, being just this slog of the English making these frontal assaults, unable to pierce through the French positions, who can reallocate their forces around their barricades, who are covered by them, who have slowed the British down by using the tops of the trees as a dense abatis outside of the fortifications that they've built. And the tally at the end of the day is almost 2,000 British and American soldiers are casualties, which is a staggering casualty rate for the 18th century. And it's something that I think really sears itself into a generation because, at that engagement, we have Thomas Gage, who of course plays a somewhat significant role in the opening of the American Revolution. We have Frederick Haldimand, who takes over from him as commander-in-chief in North America, becomes governor of Canada during the Revolution. There's probably a dozen men who end up becoming generals in the Continental Army who are part of that Anglo-American force. And they see that a well-positioned force behind carefully laid out defenses can defeat a larger British military force. And that's something that sticks with them as we get to the time of the Revolution. It also, I think, gives Ticonderoga maybe an oversized reputation as an impregnable position because this army had seemed so well prepared for this. And the French, for their part, see this as kind of a miracle. They've defeated this army that should have crushed them. And they go out the next day, they send out their scouts, and they find that this army has hightailed it. There are shoes stuck in the mud from these guys fleeing to the landing on the boats and getting back to Fort George at the southern end of Lake George. They were fully prepared for the British to return, who still outnumbered them, to bring up their artillery maybe and, crush them once and for all. So Ticonderoga, I think gives Montcalm and his forces a little bit of a sense of, wow, we've done this against all the odds, maybe overly confident somewhat, given the rest of the course of the war. And it was really the only kind of glimmer of hope that year for the French, as the British, of course, take Fort Duquesne, what's now Pittsburgh, and also the fortress of Louisbourg. But Carillon, Ticonderoga, holds out that year in this miraculous fashion.
I'm glad you brought up the formative imprint that this battle left on both the British and British Americans, because it wasn't just future officers of the Continental Army who fought in this battle. It was also the militiamen of New England who would fight the British almost a decade later at battles like Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill.
It's a really important point, and we see the generals get the kind of notoriety in some ways, but we look at the roles of American provincial troops in 1758, and we see men who are company commanders, captains, lieutenants, who end up becoming colonels, maybe even generals during the Revolutionary War. They're cutting their teeth. They're seeing how an army operates in the field. They're seeing that an army can be defeated. And people very explicitly take that message. So as the revolution is beginning, Benjamin Franklin writes this satirical kind of song highlighting all these different moments where the British army was defeated, either by inferior forces, by rebel groups. And Ticonderoga is, of course, one of those. This is a lesson they can take, that we can do this in some ways.
I think the other important lesson or aspect that this story illustrates here is the hypocrisy of British complaints during the Revolution. British officers complained repeatedly that Americans were always hiding behind trees and building fortifications that they could retreat to and hide behind, rather than meeting the British in an open battlefield. But if we look at the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga in 1758, this was something that the Americans learned to do while trying to fight alongside the British Army in the 7 Years' War.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes even further than that in some ways, and that the French army, including Montcalm and a good number of the officers and men under his command, had also fought in the War of the Austrian Succession in northern Italy, in the high passes of the Alps, where in a somewhat similar situation, a Sardinian and Austrian army blocked one of these passes from an opposing French force of 20,000 men who advanced with frontal assaults against these positions. And they lost a quarter of their strength, 5,000 casualties, which is a searing defeat for a force like this. Montcalm was on the battlefield. He was wounded and crawled off that night to get back to the French lines. And whether or not that was explicitly in his mind, it must have been, again, part of the kind of professional experience of a lot of these soldiers of, we're in a situation where we're outnumbered. We have to make the terrain and our numbers work to our advantage, even though we're a formal, regular military force.
So we mentioned that the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga took place in July 1758, and the French won that battle. So when did Fort Ticonderoga become the British stronghold and impressive fortification that we now know as Fort Ticonderoga?
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, the British refer to this place as Ticonderoga even before they actually take control of the fort. And it comes, I think, in no small way out of the fact that what native allies the English were able to muster to their side, and this is especially through William Johnson, are Iroquoian speakers. And Ticonderoga is an English corruption of an Iroquoian word, which means, by most accounts from what I've talked to Iroquoian speakers, something like a land or a place between two waters, referring to its geographic location at the juncture of Lake George and Lake Champlain. And that's how Anglophones refer to it. Now, there are a lot of really kind of charming versions of how they transliterate this word into English. Sometimes it's 2 words, sometimes it's 3 words. There's vowels all over the place. It's fascinating from a linguistic point of view to look at this, but that becomes the standard term for Anglophones that talk about this place as Ticonderoga. It officially becomes the British Fort Ticonderoga when General Jeffrey Amherst, who supplants James Abercrombie, who led that failed campaign in 1758, launches yet another expedition towards Fort Carillon in the summer of 1759. And by that point, the French, who are also being threatened at their capital in Quebec by James Wolfe's army, of course, allocate the vast majority of their forces to defending the capital along the St. Lawrence. So there's a much smaller force that's left here in the Champlain Valley. By the end of the siege, as the British are starting to kind of encircle the French positions here at Fort Carillon, there are as few as 400 French troops left here. And they are doing everything they can to slow the British, but they know they can't stop them. Effectively, their orders are, once the breaching batteries are about to open, blow it up, get out of there. In the meantime, they're firing every single gun they have at the British. There's a Connecticut soldier who writes, while they're in camp, the French are hurtling these massive 13-inch mortar shells to the tune of 1 shell every minute falling into their camp. So it's this incredible bombardment as they're just trying to keep the British on their toes, slow them down as much as possible. And eventually, by the end of July, they realize the jig is up. They light a match to the powder magazine, blowing up about a quarter of the fort, and they slip away down Lake Champlain towards Crown Point, where they end up doing the same thing there, denying those fortresses and much of their materiel to the British.
So the British triumphed at Fort Carillon in July 1759, and then the fort falls into British hands by conquest. When we left off with our construction conversation, Fort Carillon was just a large wooden and earthen fortwork with some masonry added around it, because these were the materials that the French could gather during this wartime situation. But what kinds of improvements were the British able to make to Fort Ticonderoga before it fell to the American revolutionaries in May 1775?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's one I've been particularly interested in looking at, the period from the kind of fall of French Fort Carillon to the opening of the American Revolution, because in almost all the literature that's been written about this place, that period gets almost no attention. But it's important to set up how we get to Ticonderoga's significance during the Revolutionary War. And immediately in late 1759 and then 1760, we get a situation where engineers here are preparing a lot of important improvements, because a quarter of the fort basically was blown up by the French. They perhaps had not completed all they anticipated. The English, as they use the fort in a different direction, have to make certain adjustments to it to suit their needs. The problem is that the British ultimately decide they are going to build a new fortification at Crown Point, about 12 miles to our north. There's much more land there. It's going to be a much bigger fortification. It can house more troops. The problem is that takes resources. And when you've got limited resources, that means you're not getting all back here to Ticonderoga that you would need to. And then, of course, you get to 1763 and the peace. Montreal falls, New France falls in 1760. The peace globally in 1763 does what peace does in most conflicts, which is make governments wary about spending a lot of money, because they've just done that. So we see this in everything from construction all the way down to the diets of common soldiers. And it plays out here at Ticonderoga in that a lot of the projected plans to restore the fort are unable to be accomplished. And over the peace from kind of 1763 onward, as we gradually march towards the revolution, there are continual garrisons here at Ticonderoga, which is somewhat unique because even as some of the very distant posts in the Illinois country and even the forks of the Ohio end up being evacuated by the British military to consolidate on the coasts or the new colonies of Quebec and the Floridas, Ticonderoga is maintained along with Crown Point because it's this important line of communication between New York and the government of the province of New York and the government of the new British province of Quebec. It's a lot easier than sailing around New England and the Canadian Maritimes to go down the St. Lawrence. And so they keep forces here, but they're not able to allocate the resources to repair them in the way that they, I think, would have liked to. And so what we find is on the eve of the revolution, the fort here is literally falling apart. John Montresor, an English engineer who's really notable for his work in North America, surveys the place in May of 1774. And he says, in many places, the masonry walls, the counterscarps are, to put it in his words, leaning toward the horizon, which is a nice way of saying they're falling down. And in many places, he says there are capital breaches open in the walls, which a breach is what you try to bombard, to fire into an enemy's fortress to send your troops in. Well, nature and time are doing that for them. Part of the problem was, though, that the British simply could not allocate the numbers of troops there or didn't need to. So we find points where there's as little as 15 soldiers stationed at Ticonderoga, with some of those being detached because they have trade skills to other fortifications, with some being sick, with some on other assignments. Sometimes you end up with as little as 6 or 7 men to do the work of a garrison, which on a place like this is wholly inadequate. And in some ways, we wonder if Ticonderoga would have had its prominence in the American Revolution if it were not for an accident that happened at the new fort at Crown Point in April of 1773 when there was a fire. Evidently, according to a court of inquiry that was held, it might have been started by women making soap in the barracks rooms. At least that's who some people accused of this accident. But it caught the barracks on fire, and then it caught another building on fire, and then it caught the powder magazine on fire, which leveled much of the usable structures there. And it prompted the British, knowing that they needed a place on this communications line between these various internal provinces, to shift most of the garrison of Crown Point to Ticonderoga. If that hadn't happened, it might have been Crown Point that bore the brunt of the energy and initiatives of some of the revolutionaries in 1775 rather than Ticonderoga. And they realized very quickly this was in poor shape. Montresor's reporting was in no small part to assess the fortification there and at Crown Point for recommendations on what they should do. And so by November of 1774, the government said, given the situation that is unfolding in America, what they were anticipating, that they should actually restore both Crown Point and Ticonderoga. But of course, anyone who's been in this area, certainly anyone who's lived in this area, knows that November is not when you start building projects up here. That's going to wait until the spring. And that is the spring of 1775, in which some momentous things unfold.
I'll say, and we should talk about these momentous things that happened in spring 1775, and we will, but let's take a quick breather in our story so that we can let our ideas settle and thank our episode sponsors. I don't know about you, but I can't wait to explore how Henry Knox gets these cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. I know we know he does it, but he has so many logistical, cultural, and geographic hurdles to overcome. I can't wait to hear how it happened. But I do want to take a quick moment to talk about what makes this show possible. As I mentioned at the start, I am thrilled to have the Massachusetts Historical Society join us as a partner this year. Their support will help us continue to bring you more resources and keep our content freely available. But partnerships like this one are only part of the picture to help keep this podcast going. The other part is you. Ben Franklin's World has actually always been a community effort. We've been producing this show for more than 11 years now, and it's only been possible because listeners like you believe that this kind of work is important. The work of making rigorous historical research accessible and available to everyone who has an interest. So if you've been listening for a while and the show has become part of your routine, I'd love for you to consider supporting us. You can make a tax-deductible donation at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Every bit of support helps. It helps us keep the lights on, continue to bring in great guests, and continue to offer our episodes and resources for free. So thank you so much for your help and for your consideration. And a sincere thank you to Janice B., Anna B., Christine B., Sandra C., Eleanor C., Philip C., and Lisa C. for your generous support. Thank you for helping to make this work possible. Matthew, let's talk about these momentous events that happened in 1775, because not long after shots were fired at the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775, Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys from present-day Vermont, and a contingent of men under Benedict Arnold, who was from Connecticut but carried a commission from Massachusetts, surprised and attacked Fort Ticonderoga. Why did the Americans, who were now engaged in battle with the British in Massachusetts, why did the Americans stretch their manpower to take this dilapidated and half-burned-out fort in May 1775?
Yeah, it's a striking expansion of a Revolutionary War, not yet a war for independence, an internal revolt on the perspective of the British, less than a month after the shots fired at Lexington and Concord. And the fort had drawn the attention of some revolutionaries. John Brown, a lawyer from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, had gone to Montreal at the behest of the Boston Committee of Correspondence in 1775 to assess the sentiments of Canadians. How would Quebec, this new province, go if war exploded between the colonies to the south and the British administration? And as kind of a postscript to this report said, by all means, if war does break out, Ticonderoga is vital. It's vital to control access along the interior to these places. The British knew it was important as well, which is why even the small number of troops they maintained there, because they could be used in various different directions. The governor of New York had frequently appealed to military officers, Gage and Haldimand in particular, about sending more troops to Ticonderoga or Crown Point that he could use to oppose the Green Mountain Boys effectively, claimants to land in what the New York government felt was New York. What they felt were these New Hampshire grants that they had gotten title to from the colony of New Hampshire. The military officials consistently refused these requests, saying that the army is not here to get in between land disputes between provinces. And we don't want to use the army against civilians. You've got a militia, you can call it up. There's a legal way to do this unless it's the absolute last resort. By the time we're getting to the spring of 1775, the governors of New York are saying, we are at that absolute last resort. Force is the only way to get control over these restive regions. The war explodes before the British are ultimately able to kind of do anything there. But the Americans, as I said, have been eyeing this place for its strategic location along the valley, but also after Lexington and Concord, and you get this army of observation surrounding Boston effectively. Ticonderoga is identified by a number of different parties who had been through that region prior because of the ordnance that was there. And I think this goes back to, A, the British capture a lot of French ordnance at Crown Point and Ticonderoga, and they also brought a lot of their own ordnance that they had brought up as part of their siege train. And like every army, after every war, they are often disinterested in shipping all of those heavy commodities back home. The 20th century version of this is dumping airplanes off of aircraft carriers into the ocean. But then it's to just leave cannon at this frontier fortress. So Ticonderoga had a kind of exceptional collection of artillery along with Crown Point that Americans, as they're getting into the siege of Boston, realize is vital to give them the volume and the size of artillery that they need to reach either the British in the city or the shipping lanes that can resupply Boston. And that's what prompts, as you mentioned, Allen and Arnold's expeditions, which are simultaneous, have no knowledge of each other, authorized by two separate entities. Arnold, as you know, who's from Connecticut, approaches the Massachusetts Committee of Safety about this and is given a commission by them. The Connecticut operation is not even launched by a legislative body, but by a kind of group of collaborators, many of whom are assemblymen and are able to then pull off some public money to support this. But they both head out with the intention of capturing these fortresses so that they can get the artillery that is stationed there to break the siege of Boston. And I think the whole expedition goes to show some of the very confusing situation Americans find themselves in early in the Revolution, as we're talking about different governments, sometimes private enterprises, trying to accomplish similar goals, but not always working together. It's unclear what the chain of command is. And there's a huge dispute between Allen and Arnold about who is actually in command, not just on the way leading to the capture, which they accomplish quite successfully because the British have a very small garrison here. And although it had been recently reinforced, was still nothing like what the Americans could bring against it. But even after that, they're jockeying over who actually has the authority. And it seems kind of silly, and we can look at this and say, oh, well, isn't this funny these guys are arguing about this? But it actually gets to very real issues about legitimacy and authority and command, because Arnold can say, well, I have an actual commission from a representative legislative body that's giving me this authority. And Allen doesn't have that. In fact, the Connecticut commissioners that are there with him have to kind of retroactively write him a commission to give him the authority to be in command. And we're still months from the creation of the Continental Army as a kind of pan-colonial military force. And so we're seeing a lot of the issues that Americans face kind of really playing out in real time in the capture of Fort Ticonderoga in the days and weeks afterwards.
Yeah. And one of the places that you can really see this confusion filtering down is in the local and regional governments, as you said, Matthew. One of the great places to read about this confusion is the Albany Committee of Safety Minutes, which are published. They're in published volumes. And the Albany Committee is basically the government for the upper Hudson River Valley and really upstate New York in general. They're directing much of the war in Tryon and Charlotte counties, which had until recently been part of Albany County. They were separated out in 1773. And in these Committee of Safety Minutes, you read the Albany Committee writing to the New York Provincial Congress and asking what they should do about these New Englanders who are in New York and have two different commissions. And it's a real mess, and I think a fun one to really sort out because it's all tied up in regional controversy. For example, if the Albany Committee recognizes Ethan Allen's commission from the Bennington Committee of Safety over Arnold's commission from Massachusetts, the New Yorkers really risk legitimizing the Bennington Committee and Vermont, which New Yorkers really don't want to do at this point because a lot of the large Albany landholders in particular still claim lands of Vermont as part of New York property. So if they were to grant legitimacy to Ethan Allen's commission, that's a whole gnarly ball of tangle right there.
Yeah, it's fascinating. On the way to the expedition to Ticonderoga, which they try to keep very quiet, very secretive. They don't want the British to know that there's an armed body of men marching across the countryside. But they send delegates to Albany to say, basically, can you get behind this? Will you support us? And Albany's committee says, well, we got to write to the New York City committee to see what they say. In the meantime, best we can do is not tell anyone, but we can't actively help you. And so, again, these lags in communication also become an issue because, as we'll see after the capture of the fort, in some ways, it actually is a headache for the Continental Congress. Ethan Allen, in his memoirs, or his narrative of his captivity, which is published during the war, proclaims to have demanded the surrender of the fort in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. And Ethan Allen's religion aside, his invocation of the Continental Congress is odd because the Second Continental Congress hadn't even met at 3 a.m. on May 10th. They were only meeting for the first time later that day. They had no hand in launching this. They had no control over it, but they get the message that, well, bam, these guys up north have captured a relatively unoffending British position, and they've got to kind of spin it. And they spin it not about the cannons, which is the explicit origin point from both Massachusetts and Connecticut's point of view, but from the point of view of a defensive measure taken to deny to the British effectively a launch pad from Canada to suppress these activities in New England and New York. This was a defensive measure. And it was conducted not by these two major coastal colonies and under their authorization, but by locals, referring, of course, to the Green Mountain Boys. And they actually ordered the artillery there to be inventoried carefully and sent south to Fort George, where when this whole thing is over, it can be properly accounted for and handed back to the British government, which, of course, raises eyebrows across the various colonies that had launched this expedition. And Massachusetts, for their part, writes about this, and they connect that as almost a denial, not just of their efforts in 1775 to launch this expedition to help forward the siege of Boston, but going back to the 7 Years' War. They say that, this is a fort that took 5 years of our blood and our treasure to take from the French. To give it up effectively to the British is not only to give them the initiative in the north, but also to give up what generations of New Englanders have accomplished.
Well, I know we're not done talking about regional controversies, but I do wonder if we could talk about the prize at Fort Ticonderoga. Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold captured this fort in May 1775. Matthew, what did the battle look like to take Fort Ticonderoga? It sounded like there may have only been about 15 British soldiers garrisoning it. So was there even a battle?
So calling it a battle in 1775 is coming in a bit high, in my opinion, but it is an important capture. So the forces that were brought together, including Benedict Arnold, who really didn't bring anyone with him but Benedict Arnold, which is kind of force multiplier in its own right in some ways. But Ethan Allen, the Connecticut contingent, people they'd picked up in Massachusetts, amounted in the total to perhaps as many as 250 men. But they weren't able to get enough boats to make the crossing of Lake Champlain from the Vermont shore to New York. So they initially ferried over about 80 men in two boats that they could find. But As dawn was approaching, they said, well, let's just take the opportunity of storming the fort right now. That was still twice as many troops as were inside the fort, which, as I mentioned, had been recently reinforced. It had almost doubled their numbers to about 44 soldiers and officers. But it's important to remember also that there are about 26 women and children in the fort. This was a garrison that had families, that had a community with them, as many of these forts and British installations on the eve of the revolution did, because they had been existing in peacetime. On top of that, you have British troops that this is not an invalid garrison as such, but it's a regular marching regiment with the full expectation, and this comes out in the paperwork, that they would be rotating back to England in 1775. So there were soldiers who were kind of superannuated that the colonel, according to one of his subalterns, basically kept on the rolls just because he was a good guy and he wanted them to have enough years so that when they got back to England, they could apply for Chelsea pensions. He's looking out for his men. But it means that the manpower is maybe not the cream of the crop. These aren't young, fit fighting men. They're guys who are towards the end of their careers at a post where they don't expect a lot of action, even though there'd been some suspicious activity over the winter. And they had posted a guard, but when the Green Mountain Boys and others storm up to the fort, his gun misfires. He gets hit in the face with Ethan Allen's sword, according to his account, and they storm in the fort. They take it with no loss of life. They take it in minutes. The officers can't get to the men. The men are disarmed before they can offer any resistance. And it falls to the Americans in this stunning action, which, again, when you compare this back to 1758, where a 16,000-man army sustains almost 2,000 casualties, the highest numbers of casualties when you consider all sides of the entire 18th century, that they've captured it in mere minutes in the middle of the night is a huge accomplishment. So the optics of it, in some ways, really outweigh what actually happened in the moment. What they find is all the equipment that they expected in some ways. Between there and Crown Point, which they also captured shortly afterwards, there's almost 200 cannon, depending on how we quantify these. The challenge that Arnold finds is surveying them to see exactly how many are here. Can we get to them? There's guns that are like lying in the foreshore of the lake covered in mud. There's cannonballs that are sitting in the rubble of these various fortifications. And then you've got to get to the guns and see, well, is this still usable? Or is this too far gone? And it takes time to do that, which is what they're doing over May and June as they're digging out. They're kind of getting this material ready. By the time that they have a good handle, I think, on what is there, you see us getting to the point where the Continental Army is being created. Philip Schuyler is appointed in command of what is originally the New York Department, which becomes the Northern Department of the Continental Army. And you start to see kind of unified control of the region. Arnold resigns in a huff that summer because Massachusetts basically wipes its hands saying, well, we've got bigger fish to fry in the siege outside Boston. We're going to give up our authority in the Champlain Valley to Connecticut. And that means that our officer, our man on the spot, Benedict Arnold, is going to have to be under the command of a Connecticut officer that he has no interest in being under the command of. And so he resigns his commission and disbands the men that he has collected, leaving Massachusetts to kind of pull the pieces together and renew their kind of commitment, at least in terms of manpower, to that region. But with Schuyler coming, you have much more carefully concentrated control. And it's not far from then that Americans are starting to assess the possibility of Canada's role in the revolution. And by the late summer, we see the launch of the invasion of Canada, which has the effect of kind of drawing away attention and energy and resources from the reason they had captured these forts to begin with, to get these cannon and to get them to the siege of Boston.
And these cannons were quite important because, as you said, Matthew, in the summer of 1775, George Washington was assembling a Continental Army, and by November of 1775, he had reached the point in the siege of Boston where he really needed to dispatch Henry Knox of Boston to Fort Ticonderoga to take charge of at least some of these cannons and bring them back to Boston to help end the siege. Matthew, Margie would like to know more about Henry Knox and what George Washington saw in him to send Knox on this mission. She notes that Knox was only about 25 years old when Washington ordered him to Fort Ticonderoga. So why did Washington entrust this young man with an important task?
Yeah, there's a lot of people in 1775 who I think see something in Henry Knox. He's a really interesting character because he's this young man. He's not from one of the patrician families of New England or early America. He doesn't even complete formal schooling. He's working in a bookseller's in Boston, eventually becomes a bookseller in his own right, selling books and stationery and things. And so this is not the kind of career path that we would see for being one of the most significant officers of the Revolutionary War and beyond. But I think what Knox ultimately finds is a really keen mind. He is intent on learning and he seeks it out. His only military experience was serving in a couple militia companies in Boston, which isn't nothing, but it's certainly not anything like being in a professional military force. And there's an understanding, I think, of Knox that has come down through a lot of the secondary literature, at the very least, that because he was a bookseller, well, inevitably he sold military books. And so, he'd sit in his shop and he'd read his stock and develop this knowledge for what he carried. And in looking through the list of books that we know he was purchasing and selling in his store, there's actually very few military titles. And what is there is fairly basic. It's limited to what a militia captain or maybe colonel might need to know to muster his men, go through the manual of arms, do some, general marching and stuff. And when we look at what Knox later recommends as far as literature, we realize that his own reading goes well beyond what he carried in his store, which means that he was seeking this information out. There's some evidence to suggest, I think, that he was using the library at Harvard. He might have been getting books on his own account to read, but he's reading at a very high level for this type of literature. And he's able to bring that into use as the revolution is beginning, as the siege of Boston is developing, by offering his services voluntarily as an engineer. So originally he comes to the attention of Washington and John Adams and others, not as an artilleryman, but as an engineer. Helps lay out some of the forts that are there. Evidently, he was quite successful in that because a number of officers write about it. John Thomas, who later commands the army in Canada, writes to John Adams saying that, this guy has really got a lot of skill. In fact, he says he makes a great engineer, maybe a little basic in artillery, which is ironic given that's what he's later known for. But he's coming to the attention of these individuals and they're trying to find a place for him. So by October, Washington meets with delegates from the Continental Congress, with some representatives from Massachusetts and Connecticut. And they go through and they say, well, we've got these really up and coming young volunteers. Let's give them a rank in the Army as lieutenant colonel. And one of them is Henry Knox. And to his credit, Knox clearly felt that he was due something better and did not want that commission as a lieutenant colonel of engineers. He was holding out for colonel of the artillery, which is really ambitious when you consider that the colonel of artillery, Gridley, was a guy who had served through all these colonial wars, had a great deal of respect, even though a lot of people knew that this is really a much older officer. We need somebody with more energy in this position. And Knox, felt he was the guy. And so Washington selects him. Exactly why, I can only speculate. I've never seen any writing from Washington to say, this is why I chose him. In some ways, I think he knew that Knox was capable, was intelligent, and was responsible. Maybe it was a bit of a test. Can you accomplish this? He could also spare him to a certain extent because Knox was not yet an officer in the Continental Army. So you could send him on this mission and it's not going to adversely affect what is immediately happening in the siege lines outside Boston, I don't think.
So in November 1775, Henry Knox set out with his brother and an assistant, and they made the trek to Albany, which is only about 150 miles away, but it took this party nearly 300 miles to get there on foot and horseback. Matthew, what was Knox's plan for when he arrived at Fort Ticonderoga on December 6, 1775? Jim is curious to know how he planned to haul nearly 60 tons of artillery back to Boston over a route that had to go down the Hudson River and over the Berkshire Mountains and then across the Bay Colony to get to Boston. So what was Knox's plan?
Yeah. What's interesting is that, Knox first, I should say, his instructions are not to head directly to Ticonderoga, but first to New York City. And in New York City, which he's able to get to much more easily, kind of cutting across, from Worcester through Connecticut down to New York, he's supposed to assess what they have there, what might be needed for the army, and what can be spared from New York to get up there. In the end, he doesn't find a whole lot that is useful to him in New York. They're not able to kind of give away a lot of artillery, but it is important because he does find himself making contacts with other Continental officers, with New Yorkers. And for a Boston kid, that's a big deal. These are very different people. It's a very different place. He has some adverse reactions to New Yorkers and New York City.
He's not the first New Englander to have those reactions to New York.
Not at all. He does also take the time to do some shopping, and he buys some things there for his wife, Lucy, and some equipment for his journey to the north. And in his diary, which is at the Massachusetts Historical Society, leaves what I think is perhaps the most timeless piece of text from the Revolutionary War period, when he writes, "Left New York, I am very glad to leave as it is very expensive here," which is a timeless expression of going to New York City. But he heads up the Hudson Valley using these well-worn water routes to get up to Albany and beyond, and then going overland to Fort George, and then by water across Lake George to Ticonderoga. And when he gets here, I think this is one of the big things that the kind of received knowledge about Knox and his expedition has kind of failed us is he doesn't just get here and start saying, all right, take this one and this one and this one and this one. And he's certainly not doing the lifting himself, if only because it's physically impossible to lift the kind of cannon that he's bringing. But he relies on the infrastructure of the Continental Army that is already there. So the same day that Knox gets his instructions from Washington, Washington sends additional instructions to Philip Schuyler, saying, I've sent this young guy in this expedition, help him out with this. And this is vital to the operation because Knox, who's capable, who's intelligent, who's responsible, has no familiarity with New York, to my knowledge, other than correspondence with some publishers and dealers in New York City that he had to stock his bookstore, certainly not with the northern reaches of that province, but Philip Schuyler does. And on top of that, he's in command of the Continental Army, so he can tell soldiers to help Knox on his expedition. And so orders had already gone out to the garrison at Ticonderoga to start getting the best guns that they could, the most significant ones, get them out of the ground, set them up on blocks of wood, prepare them for Knox's arrival. So when Knox gets up there, and he only spends about 5 days here, he's able to kind of assess what has already been established, kind of set on foot, guns that are already being moved to the northern end of Lake George, where they're going to be moved southward. And at the same time, the Continental Army, remember, has been advancing towards Canada. They've captured Fort Saint-Jean, they've captured Chambly, they've captured Montreal itself by the time Knox arrives there. And with the capture of those forts came other munitions. In fact, there's some really good bronze artillery that was captured from the British at Saint-Jean. And that gets sent by the troops in the theater, not by Knox, back to Ticonderoga, that Knox then has for his selection to take back to Boston. And so he's aided up here by the manpower, the labor of the Continental Army that's posted at Ticonderoga, to a certain extent Crown Point, and then Fort George, and then also by Schuyler's ability to direct a lot of this work. And Schuyler becomes even more important when the guns make the first leg of their journey, which is by water from Ticonderoga over Lake George to Fort George, where they get dropped off, because from Fort George on, all the way to Boston, south, across the Mohawk and the Hudson and over the Berkshires, all the way to Washington's camp, you don't have any more Continental soldiers, other than a stray, commissary officer here and there in places like Albany. But you don't have that manpower you can rely on. And Knox starts to enter into negotiations with locals to have sleds built and get oxen and everything else like this. And Schuyler steps in and says, no, you don't need to make this stuff. The people here have that. They've got draft animals. They've got log sleds. Let me start getting that in motion. And so Schuyler takes a lot of that work and gets the pieces kind of moving that Knox is able to then direct and set on their route southward and eventually eastward towards the lines outside Boston.
Philip Schuyler was so skilled at military supply and logistics because, like many Americans of his age, he had served in the 7 Years' War, and specifically, he had served under John Bradstreet and learned the work of military supply while in the British Army. And I always think it's a real shame because Schuyler was someone who fell victim to regional fighting, and that regional fighting took place in the Continental Congress, so Schuyler never received enough credit for everything that he did to ensure the supply of the Northern Army, including at Saratoga, or setting up a lot of the infrastructure that led to Horatio Gates's victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. But back now to Henry Knox. Knox arrived at Fort Ticonderoga. He secured a team of men, sleighs, and draft animals to carry Washington's artillery to Boston. But how did he actually get this nearly 60 tons worth of equipment across the Hudson River, up and down the Berkshire Mountains, and then across the Bay Colony to Boston? And also, I think this is also probably a very good time to talk about our next regional controversy, because Neville has a question about the regional differences between the New York Dutch preference for the draft horse and the New England preference for the oxen. So Neville would like to know what Knox thought. Did he prefer draft horses, or did he prefer oxen to help him get the cannon to Boston?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I think that comes up in Knox's expedition again and again is that, wow, they did this in the dead of winter. What an ordeal. But to put yourself in the mind of someone in the 18th century, this is the ideal time to accomplish this mission. This is why farmers clear their woodlots and haul their timber in the winter, because it's a lot easier to slide logs on sleds or just as logs over the ice and snow. You certainly don't want to be doing it in the spring or the summer. And of course, there's other stuff to do. So this is the ideal time to do it. And that's why, again, Schuyler feels there are farmers, there are teamsters who have the necessary tools and equipment to accomplish this task. And when you think about it, a log isn't all that different from a cannon when you brought it down just to its most basic level. And so it is physically about loading cannon up onto a log sled, lashing it down as safely as you can, and then hooking up draft animals to move this. And Knox does originally, from Fort George South, expect to get oxen to accomplish this work. And oxen had been used here at Ticonderoga. We know they're being employed to be the motive power behind moving these heavy commodities out of the fort towards the landing, up the portage to Lake George. But when Schuyler ultimately sets into motion the local teamsters there, they draw upon the local use of draft horses. And to put this in some context, a 9-pound cannon, according to one source, which in the grand scheme of things isn't an enormous piece of artillery, is still weighing into the area of hundreds, if not thousands of pounds, takes 4 horses to move. For the bigger guns, which are vital to the American efforts outside Boston, 24-pounders, 18-pounders, you're looking at 8 horses to move a single cannon. So when you kind of multiply those numbers by the volume of guns, Knox begins hauling 59 cannon. You're talking about a vast amount of animals. And there's an article that was published a number of years ago that kind of refuted the idea that any oxen were used in Ticonderoga's expedition, despite Knox's writing about this. And I think that almost kind of revised the history too far. And now some people say, well, they didn't use oxen at all, did they? And like, well, they did. And they used horses and they used boats. They used what was available. Getting this motive power to move these heavy commodities over the ice and snow is the most practical thing to do. You use what is available there. And there are times where it doesn't matter what it is. So as they're crossing the Berkshires, Knox records hiring additional teams of oxen to assist the horses that are carrying this along the way. And, for a New Englander, to his credit, he does seem to come around to horses by the end of it. And by the time the New York Teamsters drop off this haul in Springfield, and he's looking for new Teamsters, he seems to have a preference for horses at that point. But both of them are used on this expedition. The challenge in some ways is the weather, the terrain that you're dealing with. This is the winter. But one of the first problems they find when they get to Fort George is it's not enough winter. There's not enough snowfall to give them the hard pack that they need to move these things along. So they have to wait until they get a good snowfall. And then they get a really heavy snowfall. And it takes time for that to settle before they can start moving. So he's kind of becalmed almost at Fort George until about the new year, when he had told Washington that he was hoping to get this all by Christmas. And of course, in war, nothing ever happens by Christmas. And so he ultimately gets going in January. Then they've got to deal with crossing the rivers, which is no small thing. Again, even though it's been cold, there's some concern about how cold it's been. Schuyler issues orders to various agents along the way to drill holes in the ice, to effectively flood the ice at their crossing points, to strengthen the ice that's there. And as they're crossing the Mohawk, they lose a gun through the ice. It's the only gun that doesn't make it to Boston. They lose one other gun, one of their biggest, outside of Albany, but fortunately it was shallow enough a location. And by then they had developed a methodology so that the draft animals, the horses, would be much further ahead of the sled with a long rope, and the teamsters walking alongside would have an axe so that if the gun threatened to crack through the ice, they could cut that line to prevent the horses being pulled into the river, but also to attach a buoy to so that it could identify its position to recover it. And that's what happens in Albany. The good citizens of Albany came out and hauled out this cannon out of the muck. And as a consequence, they renamed it the Albany for the rest of its voyage down to Boston. Then once you've crossed the rivers, which is enough of an ordeal, you've got to get over the Berkshires. And going up is hard. What's harder is going down, though. That's a lot of weight when you're talking about some of the biggest guns that he's moving. You're talking about literal tons of iron and bronze. And again, Schuyler, we have from some of his instructions to agents helping with this, you would actually unhitch your animals and hitch them onto the back of the sled so that they're kind of acting as a brake as it's gradually sliding down these slopes. And then Knox finds the challenge of once you get to about Westfield, Springfield, and Massachusetts, the contract terms for the New York Teamsters are up. They drop them off, and you got to find new Teamsters to take them on that final leg to Washington's army outside Boston.
And Knox does manage to secure new Teamsters and is able to bring this collection of 58 cannon to Washington by early March 1776. So, as you said, Matthew, Knox doesn't deliver these cannon by Christmas, but he does bring Washington the artillery he requested. Could you tell us how Knox and Washington were able to set up their cannon on Dorchester Heights for March 4, 1776?
So actually, the cannon got to effectively the American lines even earlier, by the end of January. So maybe a month after Christmas, he gets them to Framingham, and that's where they drop them off. And one of the important things to remember about this expedition is that he takes and he ultimately gets 58 cannon to Washington's army, but they're just the tubes. They're just the metal barrels. He doesn't move the carriages because while the American army is lacking for many things, making stuff out of wood is something that we can do easily. Working with wood and iron, we have the capabilities for. So don't bother moving any of the carriages, especially since a lot of them are rotted up here at Ticonderoga. We can make those. So there's a lag in which over particularly February, they're building the carriages to get these guns in action as Washington is planning his next move. Alongside with that, the Americans are finalizing a series of redoubts and batteries surrounding Boston through what's now Somerville and Roxbury and elsewhere. And at the beginning of March, Washington, who has husbanded a lot of gunpowder, which is another vital commodity that we don't talk about enough, and its role in the war, has saved up enough gunpowder that they unleash on the city of Boston. And that includes some of the guns that were taken at Ticonderoga that are used to basically occupy the British, keep their heads down as they begin to move troops onto Dorchester Heights, emplace guns, build fortifications, which is a real surprise to the British. They are continually surprised, impressed maybe, by Americans' abilities to slip out in the middle of the night and develop extensive works. One of the interesting things that struck me looking at Washington's correspondence from this period in early March, though, is that his intention is not just to bombard the British and force them out of Boston. He wants to lure them out. He wants to get them in a fight, and he wants to defeat them in the field. And this is, I think, an aspect of Washington's kind of character and his, military leadership that often doesn't get enough credit. He's seen as the wily fox, always kind of getting outside of the British. But throughout the war, at various points, he is dead set on meeting them in the field. And Dorchester is one of them. He wants to draw them onto Dorchester. He wants to fight another Bunker Hill and mow them down. And he says this very explicitly in some of his writings. And the British are about to give him the benefit of that. They start loading up troops. They can see it from Dorchester Heights. The British are loading troops onto boats. There's some storms that disperse that fleet, and they're unable to make that crossing and actually get at the Americans. And so he's never able to have that engagement that he wanted. But this is really the kind of the last straw for the British. And I think it's also important to remember that the British, going back even into February, are at a point where they're realizing that their hold on Boston, their ability to maintain this post is stretching thin. They've already started pulling off some of their heavy artillery from various batteries like on Bunker Hill and elsewhere, preparing them for movement. And the Americans see this. And so this is an opportunity to move ahead the British evacuation, or perhaps, as Washington wants, engage them in a battle and really give them a thrashing that they'll have to run out of Boston with their tail between their legs. But the guns that are mounted on Dorchester Heights, thanks to Knox's work, become that final nail in the coffin that encourages the British to say, well, we're well and good surrounded by now. These guys are running out of food. They're living on ship's provisions and whatnot. It's time to go.
Yeah, and I also think it would be helpful for us to remember that at this point in time, Boston was just a peninsula. I like to visualize this by looking at the back of my right hand with my fingers together and my thumb splayed open. If you think about it, the space between your thumb and your fingers, that's where the mill pond used to be. And if you think about the space above your fingers, imagine water separating Boston and the Shawmut Peninsula from a new landmass, which is Charlestown. That's where the Battle of Bunker Hill was fought. And if you look at your wrist and forearm, you can imagine that as the Boston Neck, which was this narrow strip of land that connected the Shawmut Peninsula, where Boston is located, to the mainland of Massachusetts. So on your left side of your forearm, you want to picture land that is Roxbury with Cambridge to the north and west of that. And then on the right side of your forearm, imagine that land as comprising Dorchester. The other thing I think would be helpful to picture as we look at our makeshift map of Boston here is the fact that Boston has some high ground spots. So on the Shawmut Peninsula, near your pointer finger, is Beacon Hill. And up near the tips of your middle and ring fingers, that's Copp's Hill. You also have high ground at Bunker Hill, that's in Charlestown, and you have Dorchester Heights in Dorchester. And if you think about it, the British control your hand, the Shawmut Peninsula, but the revolutionaries have nominal control over all the other land around it. So the British are in Charlestown and they're in the Shawmut Peninsula, but The Americans are in Cambridge, they're in Roxbury, and now with these cannon that Henry Knox had brought back, they control Dorchester Heights. And I wanted to just help us visualize this because this is really important. It's the fact that Washington has the cannon on the high ground of Dorchester Heights that gets General William Howe to agree not to burn Boston as the British evacuate if Washington doesn't fire his cannon at Dorchester Heights down on the British as they leave.
Yeah, we're very fortunate to not have Boston have been burned or bombarded by either party. And I think that some of the kind of the town fathers of Boston are able to intercede between the two armies to accommodate this agreement that they're going to leave it alone. But still, despite that, there's a lot of confusion in Boston as the British are evacuating about what's going. Is Loyalist personal property going? Is army going? What gets precedent in this evacuation? And it's a major operation to evacuate not just an entire army, but a good part of a city as well.
Well, we should say that the end of this story is on March 17, 1776. William Howe's main transport leaves Boston and sails for Halifax, Nova Scotia. So March 17, 1776, that's Boston's evacuation day. Matthew, now that we're in the midst of the 250th anniversary of Henry Knox's noble train of artillery and the British evacuation of Boston, what do you think the legacy is of Knox's efforts 250 years later?
Oh, that's a good question. Knox, for us here at Ticonderoga, is one of the kind of key figures in our story. This expedition, I think, has a unique place in American military history in that it's not a grueling march of survival, nor is it one where at the end they sneak up on some enemy force and catch them unawares. It is a logistical feat. And for that reason, it's maybe one of the few logistical feats that gets its due. Logistics is not often talked about. It's not nearly as sexy as the big field battles, but it's vital. And Knox accomplishes this incredible logistical feat, which is perhaps the first great logistical victory of the American Revolution. I think it also underscores the still evolving character of the American war effort, that Knox has to rely on the Continental Army and civilians. So in that sense, maybe it's one of the first great examples of a public-private partnership in American history, because it's not just about the army, it's about civilians as well. And I think, I don't want to stretch this too far, but it must have been impressed upon Knox that he's going 300 miles to bring this massive amount of ordnance, because this was a commodity that at the time in 1775, Americans could not make. Artillery is incredibly technical and expensive to produce. They do it during the Revolutionary War in some notable areas, and it really sets off their efforts as something beyond just a colonial rebellion. If you can make heavy ordnance, and it's, I think, valuable to remember that cannon are the most powerful weapon systems of the 18th century. Nothing has more destructive force than these. And early in 1775, the only way to get them was to beg, borrow, or steal from the British, like at Ticonderoga, or other ships that are captured at sea and brought into Boston. And although I've not seen it expressly, I can't help but think that this must have had some impact on Knox in his understanding that to sustain not just the Revolutionary War, but ultimately a nation state that wanted to assert its independence and expand, needed to have the ability to provision itself with equipment like this. And so I don't think it's a surprise that by the time we get into the 1790s, Knox, as Secretary of War, establishes places like Springfield Armory to begin making munitions in the United States. And that starts off a broader history of American industrialization that leads us to America's place in the world, certainly in the 20th century, and we still deal with today in the 21st century. In some ways, I think we can tie that back to Knox's expedition as one aspect of this story that is otherwise this kind of tale of endurance and tenacity in the conditions of the early Revolutionary War, and also the incredible rise. And, Americans love a rags to riches story. And Henry Knox, I think, fits the bill in many ways of one of these kind of archetypal, almost American stories.
Well, we should move into the time warp. This is the segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. Now, the fact that the revolutionaries were going to secure the artillery at Forts Ticonderoga and Crown Point and at other posts along the Hudson River and Lake Champlain waterway wasn't a surprise to the British. But after the battles of Lexington and Concord, and even before them, Thomas Gage never felt like he could spare the manpower to try and reinforce the British garrison at Fort Ticonderoga. So in this hypothetical, we're going to explore what if he had. So in your opinion, Matthew, what might have happened if the British had had the ability to send reinforcements to Fort Ticonderoga after Lexington and Concord? How might the course of the American Revolution and its war have been different?
I should say they almost did. To get this counterfactual, we get pretty close. As I mentioned, there were reinforcements that got to Ticonderoga in April of 1775. In fact, the first batch of reinforcements arrived from Montreal on the night of April 18th, the same time that the column is marching out to Lexington and ultimately to Concord. And Gage, in fact, writes a letter to General Carleton in the governorship of Canada, ordering him to dispatch the entirety of the 7th Fusiliers from Quebec to Crown Point or Ticonderoga, where they could be positioned to block any American actions, to help the government of New York assert its claims in the region, and be prepared to perhaps overawe the Americans. He wrote that letter to Carleton on April 19th, 1775. So by the end of the day, the contents of that letter are almost obsolete. By the time it got to Carleton, the Americans had captured Ticonderoga, and the point was moot. The British might have gotten those if Gage had sent those orders earlier and he had dispatched a regiment there. They might have had a chance of holding Ticonderoga. I doubt that Allen, maybe not Arnold, but Allen could have taken the fort, certainly with the 80 men that they had had, if an entire British regiment was stationed there. But it's important to remember then, could the British have sustained that initiative? And could they have used it, like Americans feared, to push into the back parts of New England and New York, when at the time, the entire British garrison, in terms of regular troops in Quebec, amounted to 2 regiments. There was a third stationed in the Great Lakes, but they weren't getting here anytime soon, which is less than 1,000 men for the entirety of Quebec, which is not a lot. And so while the British, if they had acted quicker, might have been able to hold Ticonderoga, I'm not sure they would have been able to sustain any operations from there into the conflict that might have had a broader implication for how the war unfolded. I certainly think it would have, at the very least, delayed, if not ended, the possibility of an American invasion of Canada, which you could argue may not have affected the overall course of the war, considering how that went for us in the end. But it would have created a very different situation. Perhaps someone like Richard Montgomery would have lived longer and had a bigger role to play in the unfolding conflict. So this is a counterfactual that we actually get pretty close to some of these scenarios almost playing out in the spring of 1775.
Now, Fort Ticonderoga first opened to the public in 1909, and since that time, it has served as a significant cultural destination, museum, and historic site. As you said, Matthew, Fort Ticonderoga is really a place where historians can apply history to see what effect that the cannon might have on an earthen fortwork. So, would you tell us how we can visit Fort Ticonderoga and participate in all its wonderful Revolution 250 events?
Yeah, we have a whole host of programs going on for the 250th anniversary commemorations. The foremost of those being, if you visit during what we call our campaign season, like the armies of the 18th century, we are most active in the spring, the summer, and the fall. And in the winter, we go into our winter quarters. We don't shut down, but we take a different pace. And we have events year round. But that core campaign season running from the beginning of May through the end of October is the period in which you will see the most if you come out here. Our real-time revolution program is our living history experience, which means that when you visit during those periods through 2026 through 2027, what you will find, who you will find, the soldiers and civilians, are who was there 250 years ago to the month, the week, the day that you are visiting. So we are following the course of the revolution through the individuals on the ground as it happened during the Revolutionary War. And that means that continental troops will cycle through. We'll have troops from Pennsylvania arriving in the spring of 1776. You'll get events like the reading of the Declaration of Independence, which happened a few weeks after the document was actually signed because it took time to simply get this far north, as well as culminating at the end of the year with the successful defense of Ticonderoga in late October of 1776, an engagement that doesn't have the status of other conflicts in the Revolution, but I will argue is probably one of the greatest victories of the Revolution you've never heard of. And then through, of course, 1777, the fall of the fort to the British that summer, and a whole host of other programs throughout this. We also have an exhibition series. We have changing exhibits every year. Right now, we have an exhibit called the Revolutionary Anthology, which is our opportunity to display as much of our collection related to the American Revolution as possible. And our collection, for those of your listeners who might not know, is not just about Ticonderoga. the material that we have here, which is one of the largest and most significant collections of 18th century military material culture in all of North America, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of artifacts, covers not just the regional campaigns of the French and Indian War and the Revolution, but stuff from across North America, even going down to the Caribbean, Europe, and beyond, that express this broader period of late 18th century conflict. And our Revolutionary Anthology exhibit is the opportunity to put that out on display. And that's why we're rotating the contents every year, sometimes over 100 objects every year that are going out on display, along with other more consistent exhibits of ours looking at different aspects of the weaponry here, the history of the site, the medical history, and the archaeological history drawn from the artifacts that are on the ground. In addition to annual seminars, we host a War College of the 7 Years' War, which is a lecture program in late May. And then in late September, we have a seminar on the American Revolution, where we invite participants, everyone from senior scholars that are well-known names in the field to up-and-coming graduate students and others, to present the newest research on these topics. Again, very broadly construed, looking at this time period. So we seek to be really a center for experiencing, for learning, for researching about this time period very broadly, and especially now during the 250th.
And if we have more questions about Henry Knox's noble train of artillery or the history of Fort Ticonderoga more broadly, where is the best place for us to pose our questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can always go to our website, fortticonderoga.org, where you can get information about visiting, access things like our online collections database, as well as link to other various programs. We're also on various social media platforms, Instagram and Facebook and that kind of thing. And if you check out our YouTube page as well, we have a really robust cinematography program, and we're always putting out new videos that get into the context or the experience of stuff that was happening 250 years ago, using our site and our cast of staff members here to illustrate that all. And that's a great way to get up to speed on events like Henry Knox's expedition, whether you're watching it in the moment or you're doing it months afterwards to get yourself up to speed with what has been going on in the Northern Theater of the Revolution.
Well, Matthew Cagle, thank you so much for introducing us to Fort Ticonderoga, its history, and for helping us better understand the great feat of Henry Knox and his noble train of artillery and getting Fort Ticonderoga's artillery to Boston.
Oh, you're very welcome. I hope to see you up here sometime.
As Matthew Cagle made clear, the story of Fort Ticonderoga and Henry Knox's noble train of artillery is about far more than just moving cannon from one place to another. It's a story about how Americans, in the earliest days of what would become the War for Independence, took what they had, a crumbling fort, a self-taught officer, borrowed sleds, and the frozen landscape itself, and turned it all into a decisive advantage. Now, Knox's expedition reminds us that wars are not won by courage alone. They require logistics, coordination, and the unglamorous work of getting the right resources to the right place at the right time. And Henry Knox didn't accomplish these feats alone. Philip Schuyler mobilized the infrastructure of the Northern Army. He had Continental soldiers dig cannon out from the mud. He organized and hired local teamsters who hitched their draft horses and sleds and hauled these heavy cannon over frozen rivers and over mountain passes. Even the citizens of Albany participated as they fished out a sunken cannon from the Hudson River. This noble train of artillery was, as Matthew described it, perhaps the first great public-private partnership of the American Revolution. It was a collective effort that bound soldiers and civilians together in what would become the cause for independence. And the legacy of these efforts reached well beyond March 1776. Knox's firsthand understanding of how desperately the Americans needed the capacity to manufacture their own weapons of war helped shape the nation's future. It's no coincidence that as Secretary of War in the 1790s, Henry Knox established the Springfield Armory and set in motion a tradition of American industrial self-sufficiency that would come to define the new United States for centuries to come. Look for more information about Matthew, Fort Ticonderoga, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/436. The Massachusetts Historical Society has digitized Henry Knox's journals, and they've shared access with us so that you can read more about Knox's adventures if you want to. The link for these journals is in the show notes, which you'll find at benfranklinsworld.com/436. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please be a good friend and tell your friends about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, regional and cultural controversies impacted the work of securing and transporting Fort Ticonderoga's cannon to Boston. And I'm curious, what regional or cultural controversies interest you? This is a topic I find incredibly fun. I love to research it myself, and I'm always looking to learn more. So please let me know about your interests. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com.